December 18, 1946. Bavaria lay silent under a crust of snow, the kind that glittered deceptively, beautiful from a distance, merciless up close. In the dim light of morning, the town of Rosenheim looked like a painting drained of color. No laughter, no songs, only the sound of boots on ice and the brittle crackle of hunger in the air. The war had been over for more than a year, but peace had not come. It lingered somewhere far off, like a promise made by a drunk man, spoken loudly, forgotten by dawn. Helga Ritter pulled her scarf tighter around her neck as she stood in the ration line. She was 42, though the cold had carved another decade into her face. Her hands, red and raw from scrubbing floors, trembled as she clutched a small ration card, the only thing that gave her permission to eat. The Americans had printed it, and their ink determined who lived decently and who did not. Behind her, a woman coughed blood into the snow. No one looked. Everyone had learned to ignore what was dying. In those months, Germany existed in shades of gray. The Reich was gone, its banners burned, its dreams buried, but its ghost still whispered, mocking, familiar, impossible to silence. Men were gone, too, buried in Russia, rotting in France, or locked away as prisoners in camps that didn't yet have names on maps. The women remained, half widows, half ghosts themselves, moving through the ruins like sleepwalkers. Helga had once been the wife of a schoolteacher. They'd owned a piano. Their parlor smelled of wax and apple soap. Her husband, Ernst, had believed in things: duty, order, the fatherland. He died in March 1945 trying to defend a city already in ashes. When the telegram came, Helga didn't cry. She folded it neatly, placed it under the candle on her table, and finished washing the dishes. She had understood, even then, that Germany's gods were dying and that tears were a luxury for fools. Now, 2 winters later, the Allies called it reconstruction. But for Helga, it was survival by humiliation. Every day she waited for the ration truck, prayed the potatoes wouldn't run out, and tried to forget the taste of butter. She'd sold her wedding ring the previous spring for a bag of barley. Her last piece of jewelry, her mother's silver brooch, had gone for a bar of soap. Soap, she had murmured, bitterly amused, as she traded it, because she remembered what the world had said about soap and Germans. The American soldiers were everywhere, young, broad-shouldered, with that careless gait of victors who'd seen hell and returned with new appetites. They smoked Lucky Strikes, chewed gum, and called every woman Fräulein, whether she was 16 or 60. Some offered chocolate, some offered kindness. A few offered both at a price. Helga avoided them. She kept her eyes down, her speech brief, but she could not avoid hunger. The ration for her age and category, civilian, non-worker, dependent, had dropped to 900 calories a day that month. The cold burned more energy than food supplied. By night, she shivered beneath thin blankets, her stomach hollow and stubborn. Pride, she realized, was not edible. One afternoon, in the ruins of a church, she overheard 2 younger women whispering. "An American gave me coffee," one said, her cheeks flushed with warmth that wasn't from the cold. "Real coffee," the other giggled. "For coffee, I'd give more than a smile." Their laughter bounced against broken stone. Helga felt something twist inside her, a mixture of disgust, envy, and sorrow. She remembered how her mother used to warn her, "Dignity is a woman's last bread." Now she wasn't so sure. By early evening, she reached the front of the ration line. The clerk stamped her card without looking up. "No potatoes left," he muttered. "Flour only." Flour meant porridge again, thin and bitter. She took it silently. Outside, a jeep idled near the corner, its engine loud in the frozen air. 2 American soldiers stood nearby, laughing over something in a newspaper. One of them, tall and clean-faced, turned his head briefly, and for a second Helga met his eyes. They were calm, almost kind, but she looked away quickly, ashamed of being seen in her patched coat. She trudged home through alleys lined with rubble. Somewhere, a child cried over a broken toy. Somewhere else, a dog barked at the sound of aircraft, cargo planes flying east toward Berlin. She passed what was left of her husband's school. The blackboard still hung, cracked in half, with a single piece of chalk resting on the sill. She touched it gently, as if it were his hand. At home, she boiled a small pot of flour and water. The mixture thickened to a gluey paste. She added salt, then paused, remembering she had traded the last of it weeks ago. She stirred anyway. The window rattled with the wind. On her table lay a torn newspaper, an American edition left behind at the ration office. The headline, translated poorly by her own weary mind, read, "Germany must learn to work again." She laughed softly, bitterly. "And on what?" she murmured. "On air." But even in despair, something fierce lived within her. She began to tidy the room, scrubbing at stains long permanent. There was a dignity in motion, she decided, even when it led nowhere. That night, she dreamed of her husband. He stood beside the piano, smiling gently, his hands dusted with chalk from the classroom. "You were always the strong one," he said. She woke to the sound of the wind howling through cracks in the roof. The next morning, Helga walked to the nearby American Relief Office. It was a low building, once a bank, now filled with English signs and unfamiliar laughter. She stood at the door for a long moment before stepping in. The warmth hit her face like an insult. Inside, American soldiers sorted papers, passed cigarettes, and counted ration forms. One of them glanced up, tall, sandy-haired, with a sergeant's patch on his sleeve. His nameplate read Cole. Helga hesitated, then approached the desk. "I can clean," she said in halting English. "I can cook." Her voice wavered but did not break. "I ask no money, only food, work, roof." The words felt like stones in her mouth. Sergeant Cole studied her. He had seen many like her, thin, proud, eyes that carried too much memory. Most came begging. But this one stood straighter, as if offering a trade, not a plea. He opened his mouth to refuse. Regulations still forbade civilians from entering U.S. quarters without permission. But then he saw her hands, chapped, bleeding, and something in him softened. "What's your name?" he asked. "Helga Ritter." He nodded slowly, reached into a drawer and handed her a form. "Fill this out," he said. "We'll see." She didn't thank him. Gratitude, too, had become costly. That evening, as she left the office, she passed a mirror on the wall, one of the few that hadn't shattered in the bombings. She stopped and looked at her reflection. The woman who looked back was not the girl who'd once played piano by lamplight. Her hair was streaked with gray, her shoulders stooped, but her eyes remained sharp. She studied herself for a long moment, then whispered, "Too old to marry, but not too proud to serve." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, endless, unhurried. The streets of Rosenheim glowed faintly under the gas lamps. A child's laughter drifted from a nearby doorway, followed by a mother's scolding. Life, impossibly, continued. Helga turned toward her apartment, clutching her ration card like a passport to survival. She did not know yet that her words, spoken in passing to an American stranger, would echo across history. She only knew that she was tired, and that tomorrow, for the first time since the war ended, she would try to earn her bread not by begging, but by offering her hands. The wind carried the faint rumble of distant aircraft, American planes cutting through the dark sky. Somewhere above the clouds, food and coal were being delivered to a broken nation. Below, in one ruined town, a widow prepared to surrender the only thing she had left, her pride. And when she did, the world she knew would begin to shift, quietly, irreversibly. The jeep rattled down the frozen road, its tires crunching over a crust of half-melted snow. Sergeant James Cole sat behind the wheel, squinting through the windshield at the broken fields that rolled past. Germany in winter looked like a punishment. Gray skies pressing low, barns collapsed into silence, churches hollow as bones. He'd been here since 1945, long enough to know that victory had a smell. Smoke, rust, and old hunger. Cole was 28, a carpenter's son from Indiana, and the war had stolen the gentleness from his hands. Before Europe, he built porches and cabinets. Now he repaired cities. The army called it reconstruction, but it felt more like guilt wrapped in policy. The Germans called him Sir, though he wasn't an officer, and sometimes Americaner, with that cautious tone that could mean respect or resentment. That morning, he'd been assigned to review labor requests from local civilians. The building was an old bank converted into a relief office. It smelled of wet wool and ink. Civilians shuffled in, farmers, widows, hollow-eyed children clutching forms they couldn't read. Most came begging for coal or work. Cole listened, nodded, stamped papers. He had learned to be efficient, not kind. Kindness slowed everything down. Then she entered. The woman stood at the doorway like someone unsure whether she was allowed to exist. Her coat was patched, her gloves missing fingers. A strand of hair had escaped her scarf, silvered and frayed. She hesitated before stepping forward, and the hush of the room seemed to close around her. Cole didn't recognize her at first. She was just another face among thousands. But when she spoke, her German carried the soft edges of a voice once trained for teaching or poetry. "I can clean," she said carefully in English, her accent heavy but precise. "I can cook. I ask no money, only food. Roof." Her voice trembled, not from fear but from exhaustion. Cole looked up. There was a steadiness in her eyes that startled him. He'd seen hunger, but not like this. This was hunger with pride attached, a starvation that refused to crawl. Her ration card was tucked neatly in her coat pocket, corners folded like a soldier's letter. "What's your name?" he asked. "Helga Ritter." She stood straight, waiting, as if she'd been rehearsing this moment for days. Something flickered in him then, a faint, unwanted ache. He wanted to tell her to go home, to save her dignity, to remind her that Americans weren't supposed to hire local women. The fraternization ban had been lifted months ago, but the shame of it lingered. Still, he couldn't bring himself to dismiss her. "Do you have references?" he asked finally. She shook her head. "All dead." A silence settled between them. Outside, the wind scratched at the windows. Cole nodded slowly. "I'll think about it." He handed her a form, though he knew most never made it past the paperwork. She took it like a contract with fate, nodded once, and left. The scent of cold air and faint soap lingered after her. That night, Cole sat in his quarters, reading a letter from home. His mother had written about the baby calves born early on the farm, about his younger brother's engagement, about how proud they were that he'd stayed behind to help the defeated rebuild. He folded the letter carefully. The words felt distant, like light seen through fog. He poured a small measure of army whiskey into his tin cup and stared at the window. Outside, the sky hung low, pale and merciless. He tried not to think of the widow, but her words returned. "I am too old to marry, but make me your slave." He'd heard German women say strange things before, some seductive, some desperate, but none like that. It wasn't flirtation. It was surrender with dignity still intact. 2 days later, he found her again, sweeping the steps outside the relief office. She wasn't supposed to be there. Civilians weren't allowed near government buildings without orders. But she worked quietly, her movements deliberate, as if each stroke of the broom was a prayer. When she saw him, she straightened. "No one cleaned," she said simply. "I do not like dirt." Cole almost smiled. "You don't have to do that." "I do," she replied. "If I don't work, I don't live." Her words carried no self-pity, just fact. He stood watching her a long moment before finally saying, "There's a cottage behind the old schoolhouse. Needs fixing up. If you want work, it's yours to clean. You'll be paid in rations." Her eyes flickered with disbelief, then softened. "I will start tomorrow." He nodded, then walked away before he could change his mind. The next day, when he arrived to inspect the property, she was already there, sleeves rolled up, face flushed from effort. The air inside the cottage was thick with the smell of damp wood and coal dust. She'd lit the stove, patched the broken window with old newspaper, and swept every corner. Her precision reminded him of the way his father used to plane boards, slow, steady, without waste. "You work hard," he said. She looked up, eyes clear. I work because I must. I do not wait for kindness. Cole felt something tighten in his chest. He had come to Germany believing pity was poison, that it turned soldiers into fools and enemies into saints. But this woman didn't ask for pity. She asked for a task. And that, somehow, humbled him more than any plea could. In the weeks that followed, she continued to clean, sometimes humming softly under her breath. She never asked for extra rations or pay. Once, he caught her giving a piece of her bread to a stray dog outside. When he asked why, she shrugged. It was thinner than me. He found himself lingering at the cottage longer than necessary, checking the repairs, watching her scrub the floor, noticing how her movements filled the silence. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried weight. Once she told him, "When the bombs fell, I used to count seconds between them. I thought if I kept counting, I would stay alive." He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, and she smiled faintly, as if that was enough. Rumors spread quickly in small towns. The American sergeant and the German widow became a quiet subject of curiosity. He heard whispers at the mess hall. Guess Cole found himself a Fräulein. He ignored them, but part of him knew the truth. She was no mistress, no servant. She was something in between, an echo of decency in a world still staggering from its own cruelty. One evening, as the sun sank behind the ruined steeple, Cole brought her a can of peaches from his ration box. "For you," he said. "A thank you." She stared at it, eyes wide. "You give gold," she whispered. "It's just fruit." "In this world," she said softly. "That is the same thing." They shared it quietly at the table, each bite a strange kind of communion. For the first time in years, she laughed. A small, startled sound that seemed to surprise her as much as him. Later that night, when Cole returned to his quarters, he paused by the mirror. The face staring back was older, lined, but not entirely hardened. He realized that for months he had been living among ruins, outside and within, and that somehow, without asking, a woman from the losing side had begun to rebuild something inside him. The following morning, his commanding officer called him in. New orders were coming. Transfers, inspections, stricter oversight of civilian interactions. Cole listened in silence, a dull weight pressing against his chest. When he stepped outside, snow had started again, slow and soft. Across the street, Helga stood by the cottage door, holding a broom like a banner. She didn't wave. She only met his eyes briefly, and in that briefness everything was said. He turned away before the feeling could settle, before he could name what it was. But deep down he already knew. The line between mercy and love had begun to blur, and neither of them would come out of it untouched. By the time the snow began to thaw, the ruins of Rosenheim had taken on a strange kind of life. Smoke curled again from a few chimneys. Children, barefoot and pale, chased each other among the wrecked bricks. The air no longer smelled of death but of coal and faint hope. In the mornings the bells rang, not for prayer, but for ration distribution. And through it all, Helga Ritter moved like a quiet current of order, carrying her broom and her composure wherever she went. She now worked full-time in the American quarters, cleaning offices, scrubbing floors, and keeping to herself. The soldiers had grown used to her presence. The gray scarf, the steady hands, the eyes that neither flattered nor feared. Some called her the widow with a tone that mixed respect and pity. She ignored them. Work was her confession, her penance, her purpose. Sergeant James Cole saw her almost daily. At first, he spoke to her only about chores, the storeroom inventory, the broken stove, the endless mess left by his men. But something changed in the tone of those small exchanges. She had a way of answering that wasn't servile. It was efficient, calm, quietly ironic. When he once scolded her for overworking, she replied without looking up, "If you wish me to stop, then you must do it yourself, Sergeant." The words carried no defiance, only fact. Still, they made him laugh, which startled her enough to glance up in faint surprise. Outside the office, rumors continued to spread. Some claimed the widow was his mistress. Others said she'd bewitched him. The world, it seemed, couldn't accept kindness without scandal. Cole learned to ignore the talk, but Helga could not. She'd lived her whole life under the shadow of judgment. First the Reich's morality, now the Americans. Yet she continued to come every morning, punctual as sunrise. Her presence altered the atmosphere of the place. She hung clean curtains, mended uniforms, and planted geraniums in cracked mugs on the windowsills. The soldiers teased her for it, but no one moved the flowers. Even war-scarred men needed something fragile to remind them of life. Cole began leaving small gifts on her work table. An apple, a pair of gloves, a book of German poetry salvaged from the ruins. She never thanked him directly. Instead, she returned the gestures in her own way. A warm loaf of bread, a patch sewn on his torn sleeve, coffee brewed from whatever substitute she could find. Their exchanges were wordless but eloquent. One afternoon, when the thaw turned the roads into rivers of mud, Cole found her mopping the floor of his office. She had rolled up her sleeves. Her arms were thin but strong. He watched her for a moment before saying, "You know, you don't have to keep doing this. You could ask for lighter work." She didn't look up. "Work keeps me clean," she said simply. He hesitated. "From what?" She wrung out the mop, then finally met his eyes. "From thinking." That evening he walked her home. The streets were slick with melted snow, the sky bruised with dusk. Along the way she spoke of her husband for the first time. "He was a good man," she said, not to invite sympathy but to state a truth. "He believed Germany would rise from its knees. He died believing. I live cleaning after those who proved him wrong." Cole listened in silence. When they reached her building, a half-collapsed tenement with a single lamp burning in the hall, he said softly, "You shouldn't be alone here." She smiled faintly. "Everyone is alone here." He watched her climb the stairs until the darkness swallowed her. Weeks passed. Spring came uncertainly, like a guest afraid of being turned away. With it came new policies from headquarters, new restrictions, new inspections. The Americans were preparing for the Marshall Plan. Reconstruction required paperwork, order, obedience. It left little space for humanity. Cole began to feel the weight of it, the bureaucracy, the hypocrisy. His duty was to rebuild, yet he spent most of his days counting how much could never be rebuilt. Helga noticed his weariness before he did. One afternoon, she found him sitting at his desk, head in his hands. Without a word, she set down a cup of chicory coffee before him. He looked up. "This isn't regulation," she smiled. "Then drink it quickly." He did. It was bitter and too hot, but somehow it steadied him. He wanted to thank her, but the words tangled on his tongue. Instead, he asked, "Why do you still call me Sergeant?" She considered this. "Because you are not my friend," she said calmly. Then, after a pause, "Not yet." The air between them thickened, fragile and electric. Neither moved. Outside, a train whistle sounded, long and mournful. After that day, something unspoken threaded their hours. He found excuses to linger while she worked, asking about her recipes, pretending to need help translating signs. She began to leave her scarf hanging by his stove when the room grew cold. They shared silence like others shared music. One Sunday, Cole borrowed a jeep and drove her beyond the town, to the edge of the forest where wildflowers had begun to bloom. It was the first color she'd seen in years. She stood among them, wind catching her hair, and for a moment she didn't look like a widow or a survivor. She looked alive. "Do you miss home?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Sometimes. But after what I've seen, I'm not sure what home means anymore." She picked a daisy, twirled it in her fingers, then offered it to him. "Then perhaps this is home," she said. He took it, not trusting himself to speak. That night, back in town, he found a letter from his commanding officer. Transfer orders. Berlin, 3 weeks. He stared at the paper, its edges trembling in his hands. The next morning he told Helga. She nodded, expressionless, then went back to scrubbing the floor. "You don't have to act like it means nothing," he said, frustration slipping into his voice. She paused. "What should I do, Sergeant? Cry? Beg you to stay? I am too old to play those games." He sighed, guilt heavy on his shoulders. That's not what I meant. She turned, meeting his gaze. Then what did you mean? He didn't answer. The silence between them was sharp as glass. Days passed in strained politeness. They worked side by side but spoke little. Each carried the ache of unspoken things. On his last evening in Rosenheim, Cole returned to the cottage. Helga was there, folding linens. Without looking up, she said, "The stove works better now." He nodded. "You fixed it." "Of course." He watched her for a long time, then said softly, "You know, you could come with me. To Berlin." She froze. "As what?" "As whatever you want to be." Her hands tightened around the fabric. "A German widow among Americans? They would call me names. You would lose your post." "I don't care." She turned then, eyes glistening, not with tears, but with a kind of furious tenderness. "You care too much," she said. "That is your kindness and your curse." He stepped closer, stopping just short of touching her. "And you care too little." For a heartbeat, they stood like that, two broken nations staring at their reflection in each other. Then she spoke, barely a whisper. "Maybe we both care exactly enough." He left at dawn. The town was still half asleep, the air wet with spring. Helga watched from the window as his jeep rolled away, the engine fading into distance. She didn't wave. She didn't move. When the sound was gone, she sat at the table and began to mend a tear in his old uniform shirt, her fingers steady though her breath trembled. Outside, the sun rose over the ruins, warm and golden, touching everything it once burned. The flowers by the window bloomed despite the dust. Somewhere far above, an airplane droned toward Berlin, a reminder that life moved on whether hearts were ready or not. And in that quiet morning, Helga whispered to herself, almost prayerfully, "He will return." But even as she said it, her eyes flicked toward the empty road, knowing that promises made in ruin seldom found their way back home. June 1948. The air over Germany trembled with the whir of engines. Cargo planes streaked across the gray sky, silver birds carrying food, coal, and faith to the divided city of Berlin. The world called it the airlift. For those still walking among the rubble, it felt like redemption with propellers. In Rosenheim, far from the blockade but close enough to hear its echo, Helga Ritter watched the sky as if the planes carried her own fate. She had not seen Sergeant James Cole in nearly 2 years. He had gone north when the orders came, leaving behind a town half rebuilt and a woman who'd taught him the quiet discipline of compassion. She'd stayed, mending uniforms for the new American administration, living alone in a small room behind the old schoolhouse. People still whispered about her, the American's woman, the widow who cleaned for the enemy. She had stopped correcting them long ago. Names were easier to bear than hunger. The war's aftertaste lingered in every corner. Women still queued for ration bread. Men returned from Soviet camps, older by centuries. But Helga had found something resembling peace in labor. Each morning, she walked through the marketplace with her basket, nodding politely at those who once pitied her. Her spine had straightened. Her eyes had lost that haunted sheen. Dignity had returned, not as pride but as quiet endurance. On a humid afternoon, an unfamiliar jeep stopped near the schoolyard. She looked up from the clothesline, her hands still wet with soap. When the door opened, she saw him step out. Older, leaner, his uniform less polished, his gaze steadier. For a moment she thought the sun had tricked her eyes. Then he smiled, the same slow, apologetic smile that had once disarmed her. "Sergeant Cole," she murmured. He took off his cap. "Just James now." The air between them thickened with all the words left unsaid across 2 years of silence. He gestured toward the bench under the chestnut tree, and they sat. "I'm stationed near Munich now," he said quietly. "Inspection duty. Thought I'd see if the old town still stands." "It stands," she said, "mostly because it has no strength left to fall." He chuckled, but her tone held no bitterness. She poured him water from a tin cup. They talked of small things, the market, the rebuilt station, the way the children now played games that didn't involve hiding from bombs. But under each sentence lay another conversation, the one neither dared start. Finally, he said, "You look stronger." "I had to be." He studied her face, the lines carved deeper but dignified. "You found your peace." "I found work," she replied. "Peace is a luxury of the well-fed." He hesitated. "I tried to write." "I know," she said simply. "The letters came. I read them all. I never answered because I didn't know what to say." He nodded, understanding. "You didn't have to." They sat in silence as the sky rumbled with another plane. Children cheered in the distance, waving at the passing miracle. Cole watched them, then turned to her. "They call it Operation Vittles," he said. "Imagine that, feeding a city from the clouds." "Maybe that is what forgiveness looks like," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "You always did have a better way of saying things." As evening settled, he reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. "They're offering sponsorships," he said, "for civilians who helped reconstruction. You'd qualify. I could help you get to America. A new start." She stared at the envelope. The paper seemed heavier than it should be. "You mean as what?" "As a citizen," he said. "As a friend." The word lingered like an unfinished prayer. Helga looked down at her hands, still damp, still smelling faintly of soap. "Once, I asked to be your servant," she said slowly. "Do you remember?" "I remember every word," he said. "Then hear this one," she said, meeting his eyes. "I am no one's servant now. I built walls, scrubbed floors, buried pride, and from that I made myself again. If I go with you, it cannot be as debt or pity." Cole's throat tightened. "It wouldn't be." Her gaze softened. "Then ask me as an equal." The silence stretched between them, taut and trembling. The last light of day fell through the broken windows of the schoolhouse, scattering dust like gold. Cole rose, walked to her, and said quietly, "Helga Ritter, would you come with me? Not to serve, but to stand beside?" She held his stare, searching for any trace of mercy disguised as love. She found none, only the raw, steady truth of a man who had unlearned conquest. After a long breath, she smiled. A small, trembling thing, but true. "Then yes," she said. They stood for a while beneath the tree, listening to the hum of planes above. The world seemed to move differently around them, as if time itself had paused to take witness. Later that night, as they walked through the dim streets, they passed a shop window lit by a single bulb. In the glass, their reflections stood side by side, him in his worn uniform, her in her patched dress. For the first time, the difference between victor and vanquished was invisible. The next morning, Cole reported back to headquarters to request her papers. The clerk, a young lieutenant, frowned. "You're sure about this, sir? A German national? It'll raise eyebrows." Cole's answer was simple. "Then let them raise." He returned to Rosenheim with approval stamped in red ink. Helga met him outside the old cottage where it had all begun. She held the document with careful hands, then looked up at him. "Strange," she murmured. "2 years ago I asked for bread. Now, I'm given passage." He smiled. "Life trades strange currencies." She folded the paper neatly. "Then let this be our last transaction." That evening, they shared a meal together, simple, silent, sacred. The sound of planes filled the night again, steady as a heartbeat. Helga listened, her eyes glimmering with quiet awe. "They feed the city from the sky," she said. "Once, I thought the sky only brought fire. And now?" he asked. "Now it brings mercy." He reached for her hand. She didn't flinch. For the first time since the war, she allowed herself to touch without fear of losing something. The next dawn came soft and blue. They stood on the train platform, waiting for the transport to Munich. Around them, families clutched their parcels. Officials barked orders. Children played with paper airplanes. Helga turned to Cole. "You rebuilt houses," she said quietly. "But I rebuilt myself." He looked at her with something like reverence. "And did it better than any architect I've known." The whistle blew. Steam rose around them like a curtain. As the train began to move, She reached out, her voice low but clear. "James, if we cross the ocean, promise me one thing." He leaned close. "Anything. Never again call me your rescue." He smiled through the blur of motion. "Then I'll call you what you are." The train gathered speed. "What's that?" she asked. He watched her through the window as the distance widened, the wind scattering his words into the roar of the engine. "My equal." And as the train disappeared down the long, shining track, the planes roared overhead once more, feeding a divided world with the same fragile thing she had learned to give again: hope.